This presentation will seek to explain why children with hearing loss often face challenges in the development of language and literacy. A useful way to look at the audiogram is to superimpose a speech banana on it. The speech banana is so called because of its shape. It represents the intensity and frequency of sounds of speech, or phonemes in language, which, when placed on the audiogram, form a banana-like shape. Hearing loss within the speech banana can have serious implications on the person's ability to follow what is being said to them. Hearing loss is never the same for each child. The degree of hearing loss can vary. A child with a moderate hearing loss can miss 25 to 40% of what is said in the classroom and often experiences difficulty learning early reading skills such as letter and sound associations. With a moderate hearing loss, 50 to 80% of speech signals can be lost. With hearing aids, a child can hear but may miss much of what is said if the environment is noisy or reverberant. The child could experience language delays including delayed or disordered syntax, limited vocabulary, imperfect speech production, and flat voice. A child with a moderate to severe hearing loss can miss up to 100% of what is being said if their amplification is not working properly. They may have had substantial speech and language delays. Children with severe and profound hearing loss, even with hearing aids, are typically unable to perceive all high-pitched speech sounds sufficiently to discriminate them. Children with profound loss will not be able to perceive most speech sounds, even with hearing aids. These children often have delayed language skills. Exposure to sound begins in utero. A fetus can hear sounds beginning at 20 weeks gestation. Newborn babies are able to distinguish between all speech sounds. By the end of their first year, babies lose their ability to differentiate sounds to which they have not been exposed. Language starts the minute we are born and never ends. All sounds that come into the brain are processed, and a map is laid down that lays out specific speech sounds in the child's native language. Listening allows the brain to lay down a template for speech sounds and allows the child to later attach meaning to the sequence of sounds they hear. From birth to age 2 is a critical time period for children to develop expressive and receptive language. From age 2 to 7, the window of maximum language development slowly begins to close. Therefore, it is easy to see how deaf and hard-of-hearing children are at a disadvantage for optimal language development, particularly if their hearing loss was late diagnosed or early intervention services were not offered or accessed. Ramey and Ramey state, a robust body of knowledge exists about the first 5 years of life and the extent to which children's early experiences correlate with their competencies in language and literacy. Ramey and Ramey are not the first researchers to show a direct correlation between language competencies and literacy development. When children have strong language abilities, they have an easier time developing literacy skills, which leads one to question, how exactly is language acquired? Mayer and Wells discuss language acquisition is dependent on 4 key factors: exposure, access, meaningful engagement, and capable language users. They suggest to acquire language, a learner must have exposure in quality and quantity to an accessible language while engaged in meaningful activity with others who are already capable users of the language. A child must have meaningful daily exposure and interactions with the language. The exposure to the language must be rich in quantity and quality. This, of course, means nothing if the child doesn't have appropriate access to the language, meaning, can the child hear or see the language, whether that be via a spoken or signed language? It's important to understand the difference between audibility, the ability to hear the sound, and intelligibility, the ability to understand what the sound or words mean. Without appropriate access, the child cannot acquire a language. For language acquisition to develop, it must be done in a manner that is meaningful. Meaningful experiences are the result of interactions the child has with the speaker. This can include things such as labeling, talking in the sandbox or a learning center, and face-to-face conversation. Language interactions must be with a person or persons who are capable users of the language. Fluent users of this language allow for the child to receive exposure to skills necessary for the language, including vocabulary, syntax, discourse, and phonemic awareness. Exposure and understanding to these elements of language is fundamental for early and long-term literacy success. It is easy to see how children with hearing loss could struggle to have these conditions met, thus impacting their ability to acquire language. Language and its components, sound, vocabulary, and grammar, are mastered in early childhood through implicit teaching. Children learn by simply interacting with adults and other children. Most hearing children begin speaking by the age of 2. By the age of 5, they have acquired a vocabulary of 2,000 or more words. By age 6, most children have a thorough knowledge of the sound system of their native language, its grammar, and a large amount of the meaning the language creates. For deaf children, this can be delayed depending on age of hearing loss identification, access to sound, and the type and level of intervention services that are provided. Between the ages of 6 to 10, written language is acquired through schooling. We know that deaf and hard of hearing children, especially those with severe to profound hearing loss, often lag behind their hearing peers with language development. It is important to remember, language does not necessarily mean sounds or voice, but can be manual signing as well. When a child has the ability to use language for a range of functions, they are said to have communicative competence. This is further broken down into 3 distinct branches: meaning, form, and use, or pragmatics. The meaning includes vocabulary and needs to be an age-appropriate vocabulary. Form includes such things as phonology, the littlest building blocks that make up the word. In signed language, this would be the place, movement, and location of the sign. Morphology is the biggest chunks of the language, and syntax, the sentence pattern and arrangement of words. Use, or pragmatics, is dependent on what the language is for. This includes social interaction, cognition, identity, and academic learning. When dealing with deaf and hard of hearing learners, one must regularly ask, does the child have enough language to do school? And make adaptations to build upon language abilities if the answer is no. All of these components must be mastered by children to be proficient users of a language. After learning about the conditions necessary for language development, it makes sense that Phase 1 of Mayer and Wells' phases in the process of literacy development is learning the first language. For many hearing children, language acquisition happens relatively easily. They overhear conversations in their environment, which builds upon their language and development. Signed language must be seen. Deaf and hard of hearing children who use a signed language do not see as much language as a hearing child would hear because they do not overhear conversations. Spoken language must be heard. With the improvement of early intervention services and technology, one would assume deaf and hard of hearing children with amplification are on the same language development field as their hearing peers. Unfortunately, access is dependent on the effectiveness of their hearing technology, such as cochlear implants and hearing aids. For many, this technology is not enough to provide them with the same level of language access as their hearing peers. Therefore, they are lacking in the quality and quantity of language in their environment. We know that many deaf children have delays in their language development, particularly face-to-face language. If the deaf and hard of hearing child does not have a full face-to-face language, they do not have the requisite language base in place for age-appropriate language and literacy development. Therefore, it is key that deaf and hard of hearing children develop a fluent and age-appropriate spoken or signed language system to aid in the development of early language skills. We know that children with hearing loss learn concrete words like cat, jump, 5, and red more easily than abstract words like before, after, equal to, and jealous. They also have difficulty with function words like the, an, are, and ah. Children with hearing loss have difficulty with multiple meaning words such as calf. The goal of the second phase of literacy development is social to inner speech. This phase is when the child transitions from using language to communicate with others to communicating with oneself. Thus, language becomes a tool for thinking. In this stage, children are given more and more print experience. Here, children will start to use the standard alphabet in random or memorized patterns, such as their name, and will begin to differentiate between words. This stage of development can be nurtured through activities such as reading at bedtime, an activity that may be difficult for some children in terms of access and/or capable users of the language. Without a fluent language base, it is difficult for deaf and hard of hearing children to transition to the next phase of literacy development, as they require a solid language base to form questions, tell stories, and initiate interactions with not only those in their environment, but also with text. Therefore, it makes sense that there is often a discrepancy between their incomplete spoken and/or signed language system and the requirements to read using a speech-based system. If the deaf and hard of hearing child's first language is a signed language system, they are expected to develop reading and writing in a language that they have not acquired. Vygotsky, Watson, and Wells explain, the ability to think in a language and to later read and write it has much to do with how well one can communicate in the language in the first place. The third phase of literacy development is when written expression is introduced. In this phase, children are asked to not only use face-to-face language, but to also use print. No longer can the child solely depend on spoken or signed communication to express their ideas. They must now take those ideas and put them into writing. This is a key step in the literacy development process in which learners bring together their knowledge of spoken language and their knowledge of how print works. In other words, this is where learners see how words and pictures are connected to language. It is at this stage children learn that letters represent words, not objects. This phase is easier for hearing children because, as Taborowski explains, for hearing children, written language is a relearning of spoken language. Mayer explains this phase of literacy development is when the differences between deaf and hearing learners begins to show. Many deaf children have a general idea of the task presented and attempt to make a relationship between the text and the language, but often lack the strategies and knowledge to successfully do so. Children with hearing loss often have difficulty understanding and writing complex sentences, such as those with relative causes. For example, the teacher whom I have for math today was sick, or passive voice, the ball was thrown by Mary. Language is not created equal. It is important for everyone to have knowledge of language beyond everyday conversational proficiency or BICS level language. This language is our common everyday chit-chat. It consists of high-frequency vocabulary, such as run and fire, and simpler sentence structure. It is the non-formal, cognitively undemanding language. Dr. Jim Cummins, in his exploration of children developing a second language, coined the term Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, or KELP-level language. This language is more abstract. It is vocabulary we use less often and is often language used for cognitive learning. It often has complex sentence structure and grammar. KELP is often in print or print-driven. KELP is used in the academic setting and becomes increasingly used from grade 3 onward. If a deaf and hard of hearing child hasn't fully developed their first language, signed or spoken, they struggle with understanding of KELP terms. Hearing children pick up KELP language much easier as it is often overheard in their environment, thus not always needing to be explicitly taught. A comparison of BICS versus KELP-level language would be the sentence, Mary saw something wonderful. This sentence uses simple language and sentence structure, or BICS language. Whereas, if I were to say, a wonderful sight met Mary's eyes, or Mary came upon a wonderful sight, the grammar, vocabulary, and sentence structure becomes much more complex, thus becoming KELP language. Phonological sensitivity is the ability to detect and manipulate sound structures of oral language. It generally follows a progression: words, syllables, onset time, and phoneme level. Under its umbrella is phonological awareness, or the larger pieces of language, and phonemic awareness, also known as the individual sounds. Its development is overlapping in nature and is related to vocabulary development. Phonological sensitivity is implicitly taught. It is all through the air, meaning it is often with no print and is therefore all listening. Children with smaller vocabularies may experience challenges and delays with developing phonological abilities. Phonological abilities predict later literacy success as it is associated with subsequent decoding, or reading, and encoding, spelling skills. Children who are deaf and hard of hearing are often deemed to have a double deficit, as they often exhibit delays in both phonological abilities, but also vocabulary and lexical knowledge. When one moves through the stages of literacy development, their previously learned skills build upon each other. A child brings information from the learning of the alphabetic principle, understanding the links between letters and sounds, to phonemic awareness, which then leads to phonemic decoding. If all of a child's energy is going into the decoding of words in which they are reading, it makes it difficult for them to make sense of the language. Simply put, a child needs to be able to decode in order to read and write English. Phase 4 of literacy development is when the connection between language and print is developed. It is in this phase that the relationship between spoken and written language has been made. Therefore, the child can easily construct meaning from the text. The development of literacy for educational purposes is found in this phase. It is assumed when children enter this stage of literacy development, they have established basic literacy skills and that they've formed a connection between face-to-face language and print. Many times this is a difficult phase for many deaf and hard of hearing learners and is often when the gap between deaf and hard of hearing and hearing learners becomes exceedingly evident. Mayers explains, fluency at this stage goes far beyond a functional level of literacy, is necessary for advanced academic study, and is the standard by which success as a literacy learner is often measured, a standard that many deaf learners often fail to meet. If one were to use the Inukshuk as a visual example of literacy foundations, with each pillar representing a construct or skill, it is easy to see if one pillar of the Inukshuk is not properly developed, it will affect the structure and development of literacy skills. Therefore, it is imperative that teachers, parents, and support workers work together to ensure that the deaf and hard of hearing child is given timely and appropriate access to language through whatever means necessary to ensure literacy success.